Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, let me bring you to yet another issue, which is Tony Blair today, as you've seen, is suggesting that we could have a different regime on migration inside the EU, which would allow us to stay in. Do you welcome his intervention?
Well, it's a bit late now, this epiphany. I'm not sure where he's been. Well, we know where he's been. He's been travelling the world. The country wants proper controls over immigration. We've seen that in election after election, and we saw that in the referendum last year. The country's taken its decision. We're leaving the European Union now, and that means freedom of movement has to end, whether we like it or not. So there are now going to be restrictions, and Tony Blair has to accept that now. There have got to be restrictions on those coming here. I think it's a pity he didn't think of that when all these new countries were admitted to the European Union on his watch.
But if there was a way of persuading the other members of the EU to introduce a new regime, at least for us, do you think that could possibly allow us to stay inside the EU?
No, the country's decided we're leaving the European Union,
that.
and we've got, we've got to get on with that. Tony Blair's got to get over it, and we've got to get to a smooth and successful exit from the Union. But that will involve some proper controls over immigration. I think that's what the country wants to see.
He also says in this article that senior members of the government know that Brexit is going to be a real problem, even a disaster for this country, but are too frightened to say so, except in private.
Well, Brexit is a huge challenge. We've got to reverse 40 years of integration into the European Union, covering all the different sectors, whether it's agriculture, fisheries, trade, even security and fighting terrorism. That's a huge exercise that we're now engaged in, and we've got to achieve successfully. But the decision has been taken, and there are opportunities that will open up as a result.
Now then, as we've heard, the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, believes the EU could still adjust free movement of people in such a way that Britain could then remain inside the EU. And he's also admitted that the policy of open borders he so enthusiastically pursued in government is no longer appropriate. But whatever its flaws or merits, isn't this, as we've just heard, an idea that has simply come too late? Mr. Blair joins me now. And I guess we could start with that. It's an interesting idea, but there are numerous hurdles, not least that we have now voted to leave the EU, and that is that.
Yeah, and I completely understand that, and what Michael Fallon's just said to you now is a perfectly sensible view. It's to say, look, the British people have taken this decision, and therefore there's no way out of it. What I'm trying to say is, and you could see this in some of what he was saying to you, this decision is life-changing for this country. And this is a moment when every member of Parliament, including the people like Michael Fallon, who frankly believe that Britain's better off in Europe and not out of it, have got to see if there is a way of meeting people's legitimate grievances and anxieties that gave rise to that Brexit vote, but do it in a way that doesn't undermine the economy of the society and the country and its standing in the world. So what I'm trying to do with this immigration paper that my institute's published today is have a comprehensive look at European immigration, say there are ways of controlling European immigration that don't mean you have to do Brexit. And then, by the way, you can concentrate on non-EU immigration, which I think is actually a bigger concern for most people.
OK, and a lot of people already this morning have said it's a little bit rich coming from you, given how you opened the doors back in the 2000s to mass immigration and changed lots of communities.
Right, so first of all, we shouldn't exaggerate this, by the way. In 2004, we could have imposed transitional arrangements on those accession countries, the 8 countries. Actually, the majority of EU migration since 2004 has been from outside of those countries. And we would still have had freedom of movement, if not freedom to work. But the real point is, the situation back then was different. Look, when I left office in 2007, the economy was strong. There was no National Health Service winter crisis. The health service satisfaction levels were at record points. Educational attainment was rising. Crime was falling. Right. Inequality was narrowing. 2017, post-financial crisis, post-austerity, no, you've got to listen to what people are saying and react to it.
But we did have hundreds of thousands of people coming into this country after that decision quite quickly. And lots of communities up and down the country, all up and down the East Coast, for instance, parts of the Midlands and the Black Country, were changed very, very fast. And people didn't understand that. Yep. And the question, I suppose, is, do you accept that among all the reasons for the Brexit vote, that was part of it?
I accept that EU migration, including from those accession countries was obviously a factor. I do think it probably isn't the biggest concern on immigration, but here's what I'm saying now, because we're not 13 years ago. With 2017, the circumstances are completely different, and we've had the Brexit vote. If, for example, the anxiety is downward pressure on wages as a result of an influx of EU migrants coming and doing work, say, in the construction industry, we have it within our power to deal with that by domestic legislation. In addition, for example, now there is a directive being supported by the French president that would specifically bar the undercutting of wages and local bargaining from EU migration. So if we want to deal with those questions, we can deal with them without the sledgehammer that, as it were, through Brexit, destroys the EU migration that we'll actually need, because my paper shows that we actually need most of these EU migrants. And it doesn't, of course, deal with the other parts of the immigration issue, which I think are the greater concern.
But nonetheless, the British people voted to take back control of their borders. So any change in internal EU migration would have to be quite a dramatic one. Can I ask you whether you see any sign whatever that any of the leaders of the EU or the national leaders are prepared to revisit what is one of the 4 pillars of the EU free movement?
I think there are signs, and I've just given you one, which is specifically dealing with this issue of undercutting of wages. I think you could go back and argue in Europe today for example, an emergency brake that didn't just deal with benefits, but also deal with the influx of people. And I think there are things that we could do domestically, like registering people who come in and those that go out. I think you could probably get a restriction on those that come. We tried to do
this in 2016 under David Cameron and failed.
But this is post the Brexit vote. And the thing that I'm saying is that, you know, at the moment, you either do leave Brexit, as Michael Fallon's just been saying to you, even though, does he really think it's a smart thing to do? No, he doesn't, but he feels he has to. Or we have the status quo. I'm trying to say this. In the end, Brexit is a distraction, not a solution to the problems this country faces. If members of Parliament really believe that, then their obligation is to set out solutions that deal with the actual problems communities and people have, and not do Brexit, which is actually going to distract us from those solutions and going to cause real economic and political damage.
When you observe these negotiations, which are not going terribly smoothly at the moment, and you've been to see Mr. Juncker and warmly embraced him and so forth, whose side are you on?
I'm always on the side of Britain. But the question is, what's in the British interest? And in my view...
Have you offered any advice or help to the Brexit team on the British side?
No, but I'm very happy to. But they probably wouldn't want my advice, because what I would be saying to them is enlarge the options. Look, just understand what the problem of Europe is with the British position, because it's really important people understand this. For over 3 decades, British governments under Margaret Thatcher, under John Major, under me, have been arguing 2 great causes in Europe. One is the single market, make Europe not a federal superstate, but a bigger economic market, bring more prosperity to European people. And the other is enlargement of the European Union. You've just been talking to Michael Fallon and Jens Stoltenberg about the dangers of Russia. Think if we hadn't brought those East European countries into the European Union. So these are the 2 big causes for 30 years Britain's fought for. They're now the reasons, apparently, we want to leave. So,
and we have decided to leave. That is the thing I keep coming back to. We have taken the decision. The vote's been out. It was a democratic vote. There's more than 1 million people in the majority, and that is going to happen unless something really dramatic changes. And I want to take you on to how you could get the second referendum that I think you want. Because you look at the House of Commons and you ask which of the parties is going to call for a second referendum, and you look around scratching your head in vain.
Yeah, so here's the thing that I think each member of Parliament's got to do at the moment, is to look at this decision in a different category from the normal decision where you obey the party whip or, you know, any ordinary piece of legislation. This is a decision that really changes the destiny of this country for generations.
You're saying go out and rebel for Britain?
No, I'm saying this. I'm saying if you believe there is a better way through, and I'm trying to suggest, and we'll publish more papers over the next months, there are better ways of dealing with the country's problems than Brexit, then at least try and explain that to the country. Find the leadership within yourself to say to people, there is a different and better way. Now, if the country doesn't change its mind, I've always accepted. If there isn't a change, then Brexit will go forward. What I'm saying to those in positions of political leadership and those members of Parliament at the moment is, guys, this is not an ordinary decision. So make this make this one where you're prepared to go out, and if you think that there is a different and better way, put it before people and argue for it.
But I'm interested in what actually is going to happen, how you achieve this. Now, Lord Adonis, Andrew Adonis, a former close colleague of yours, suggests today that the House of Lords could have an amendment to this legislation saying it can't go ahead in the end without a second referendum. And that would then come to the House of Commons. Now, in those circumstances, is that really what you're calling for, is members of the House of Commons to vote for a second referendum?
No, I'm calling for something prior to that, because before you get to that, this thing will go ahead unless it starts to become obvious that the public is having second thoughts. That when they see what leaving the single market and customs union means, that they start to say, well, actually, is there a different...
It hasn't become obvious yet, has it?
No, it hasn't become obvious yet, but maybe if we, who are in politics, either in Parliament or outside of Parliament, put this case to people, maybe they will listen. If they don't, I accept it goes forward. But here's the other thing we've got to remember about the referendum. We voted for Brexit without knowing what the terms of the alternative relationship are.
Well, I think it's had to. There's no way of knowing what the alternatives were.
Exactly,
really.
There's no way of knowing, and we've learned a lot since then. My point, again, is very simple. As the government comes to look at the terms of Brexit, surely it's a very common sense thing to say that we take our final irrevocable decision once we see what the alternative is. Because, you know, to use the old house swap analogy, we agreed to swap our house, but we haven't yet seen what the other place looks like. If when we see it, the country has a change of mind, then surely it's entitled to have that change of mind.
Except that we have signed the contract, which was Article 50. So in terms of the house buying thing, the deal is going through at the moment. Now, can I ask you about...
Yeah, but we've not looked at the alternative terms. And by the way, let's be very clear. Brexit, in my view, is very, very damaging for Britain. It's damaging for Europe. If you look at all these...
But if your immigration plan, your alternative offer on immigration is to actually happen, then the EU has effectively to come to us and say, we have got this great new idea which might keep you in. Yeah. And there is no sign of that whatever. Well, in fact, Macron and Merkel have both said the 4 pillars are sacrosanct, we're not going to touch them, don't even think about it.
Yeah, but what they're saying is you shouldn't abandon freedom of movement, and you shouldn't, by the way, because it actually has a beneficial impact. You can restrict it, and you can qualify it, and this is not just a question of Europe coming to us. Again, as I say, if we had sensible political leadership right now, we would also be going to Europe and saying, here are a range of different options. So let's investigate each one of them. And the whole purpose of this is to be in a situation where if, for example, the country then finally decides, look, we want to do this, it's more important than anything else, fine, there's nothing I or anyone else can do. I'm just, in a sense, with a renewed sense of mission on this, because I think for future generations, this is a decision of such moment and importance that we've at least got to be prepared to argue the case.
Not a renewed sense of mission, please. Anyway, let me ask you about another thing you say in this article. Again and again, you say that there are senior doubters inside the government. Now, we know that Philip Hammond and others have not been enthusiastic about Brexit, but you're implying that there are actually Brexiteers who have changed their mind as they've seen the way the negotiations are going.
Well, I think there may or may not be that. No, I was meaning more the people who voted Remain and are now, as Michael Fallon's just been saying to you, we got no option. We're just bound, we've got to carry on. What I'm saying to them is, look, if there's a different and better way that you can meet people's concerns, particularly on the issue of immigration, as I say, because Brexit only affects EU immigration, it doesn't affect the rest of the immigration picture. If there's a different and better way, articulate it, argue for it.
None of us are pitch-perfect soothsayers. Is it possible that Brexit might work very well for this country?
You see, I think the only circumstances in which Brexit works, and this is the fantasy of the real Brexiteers, they are, in one sense, right, that if you leave Europe, Britain should become a light touch, light regulation. It should become marketed...
Join NAFTA.
Right, it should become marketed as not Europe. The risk is the British people won't vote for that. They're not going to vote for the huge economic and social restructuring, to the changes to the health service and other things that would require. And the risk is, actually, that we have a Brexit followed by, I'm afraid, an unreconstructed leftist programme from Labour. And if you combine those two things together, in my view, we will be in a very serious situation as a country. And therefore, this is why this is not just about Brexit, by the way. It's about how does the centre ground of British politics recover its traction and show that there is a change that we can make to our country that really deals with its problems and doesn't go down the false path of either old-fashioned programmes of left or right.
And yet, like many people, you were completely wrong about Jeremy Corbyn. You said that if he was elected as Labour leader, there would be a meltdown, a catastrophe of the Labour Party. In fact, he turned out to be very, very popular and won nearly as many votes, dare I say so, as you did in your first campaign.
Yeah, and you know, again, what I've said to people is, I take my hat off to the way he fought the campaign and to the enthusiasm he generated. But it doesn't make that programme right. And, you know, I still think there are many millions of people in the country who want a way forward that makes the changes that make our country fairer, that gives a heightened degree of support for social justice and for greater social cohesion, but does so in a way that is modern and progressive and not backward-looking, either by going anti-immigrant on the right or anti-business on the left.
Before the summer break, there was a lot of talk about a new political party to represent those kind of centre, outward-looking values you're talking about. Is that now for the birds? Is it gone, that idea?
Well, look, I've never been wanting a new political party. I want the Labour Party to come back to a position where I think it can win an election.
It ain't going to. It's not going to, is it?
Well, at the moment, it doesn't look like it. But
therefore,
it doesn't really matter what I say or what anyone else says. I can just tell you this. There is a huge amount of political energy out there in the country that is searching for a home. Now, if the two main parties don't give it a home, it's going to search for a different home. It doesn't matter what I say or what anyone else says.
But somebody will create a new party to channel that energy.
I honestly don't know, but...
Because if they don't, all of this is, with respect, meaningless, isn't it?
Well...
People have to vote for something.
In the end, yes, they do have to vote for something. But the one thing I would say about present-day politics, and you know, as I always say to people, I'm a student of politics again, because I accept there are things that I've not understood about the current situation politically. But the volatility of politics is its principal characteristic at the moment. And you know, yes, we had Donald Trump and we had Brexit, but we also had Macron in France. And
just going back to Corbyn, we said it would be a disastrous programme. He has picked up on a huge amount of anger, which is real. Lots and lots of people have seen their incomes going down. Lots of young people see nowhere to live and see no prospects of hope for themselves. There is a lot of anger in this country about the effect of what they call neoliberal economics, which happened on your watch as well.
Yeah, so if you combine Brexit with the Corbyn programme, unreconstructed, then I think we've got a serious problem, as I've said before. Yes, there's a lot of anger, but give people an answer. So there are answers to the anger. There are answers on tuition fees, on social injustice, on communities left behind. You know, what should we be dealing with as a country today? The technological revolution, infrastructure, making sure that we're geared up to the enormous changes that are coming down the pipe at us. Brexit on the one side, anti-business, old-fashioned leftist programs on the other. They may ride the anger, but they don't provide the answer.
A very geared up Tony Blair. We've run out of time. Thank you very much indeed.
At least it looks like it's going to be a quiet few months ahead. Just the teensy-weensy matters of Brexit, Theresa May's leadership and the looming spectre of a nuclear apocalypse over North Korea. Nothing to worry about. It's all about Brexit for us this morning. After a summer of positioning and minimal progress, it really is about to kick off. Up first, the big beast and arch-rebel Ken Clarke. Is he getting ready to take on the government over the big EU withdrawal bill? A little later, I'll be speaking to the Justice Minister and one of the faces of the Leave campaign, Dominic Raab, and I'll be trying to make sense of the Labour Party's latest Brexit policy with the Shadow Health Secretary, John Ashworth. Well, let's go right ahead and speak to one of the loudest voices fighting against the Brexit tide. Ken Clarke joins us now from Nottingham. Mr Clarke, a very good morning to you.
Good morning.
Let's dive straight on in with Brexit. And the negotiations at the moment appear to have stalled for one reason, the financial settlement. Rather than us getting together with Brussels and trying to get to grips with a number that suits both sides, it appears our strategy has changed somewhat, and we are now arguing that there is no legal obligation for us to pay anything. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the concentration on the money is because large parts of the media, I mean, not of course this very respectable programme, think it's the only bit of the thing that they can interest their readers in. I think the average member of the public is very switched off with all the details about single markets and customs unions, tariff barriers, things which weren't talked about at all during the referendum campaign. It's quite easy to get people excited when you say the government's going to pay money to foreigners. After all, they were told that £350 million a week was going to be spent on the health service once you stop paying any money to Brussels. Now, everybody knows that if you are going to have access to the market, you're going to have to pay some of the costs of that. And the Central and Eastern Europeans will expect regional funds to help them one day become more competitive with the French, the German and the British. And if the British want to be part of that, they'll have to pay a contribution. And there are all sorts of things we've signed up to. There are budgets which we signed up to, things we will benefit from. And it's just a question of how much. Now, I understand
Mr.
why
Clark,
David
that's a fairly big question, though.
Mr.
Mr. Clark, that's a fairly big question, though, isn't it? I mean, the Brexit bulldog himself, David Davis, writing in the Sunday Telegraph this morning, says this: with the negotiations delivering steady progress on issues like citizens' rights and Ireland, this is not a moment to go backwards. No mention of the financial settlement. It appears we're a country mile away from that.
Well, the financial settlement is, of course, important. But if you announce it now, we all know that everybody on the right of British politics will say this is outrageous, appalling. Particularly all the Eurosceptic newspapers will say this is absolutely shocking and disgraceful. And everybody on the other side will start explaining what our legal and moral obligations are and what benefits we get in return for it. Now, I quite understand. I think the British government wants to leave all that until we've got a little much further on with the big, substantial issues. The sum of money is not ruinous to the British economy. It's not out of line with what we've been paying for the last several decades. I think it's the EU's going to insist there's some agreement on how eventually it's going to be calculated, what is in, what is out, what is the basis of working out how much. I understand why David wants to sort of draw a line there and get on with other things. Otherwise, the whole debate in Britain will get comically dominated by arguments about how outrageous it is that we should pay a penny. It's like the constant debate we have trying to defend overseas aid, which is very well spent money, but it's quite easy for a populist to tell somebody, why is British taxpayers' money spent abroad? Why isn't it being given to you or spent on your public services?
I mean, given all of that and given your opposition to Brexit itself, let's say, I mean, I wonder what you make of the comments from the former Prime Minister Tony Blair this morning, that we can hold on to single market membership, that we can enjoy all those benefits, we can stay inside the European Union. All it takes is a few domestic law changes when it comes to immigration and, of course, the European Union to do the same. What do you think?
Well, I'm pessimistic about staying in the European Union. I think but Parliament voted by an enormous majority to be bound by this referendum. I think, myself, it's inevitable we are going to leave the European Union. What matters now is how to keep as much of the benefits we've had for the last 40 years. I mean, this has been the basis of our relationship with most of the countries and the rest of the world. We're one of the leading influential players in the EU, and it's certainly played a big part in the comparative prosperity, on the whole, for most of those years, rising living standards in this country. Now, Tony still thinks we can stay in the EU. I think the mood in the country, it's hopeless to expect that. What we now need to address is the practical consequences. What's our new relationship? And the idea, I mean, the single market and the customs union simply mean we don't start putting new barriers between ourselves and our biggest single market and the main attraction for investment and so on. And I think that we probably can achieve. It is quite important, and I say that most of the public, I mean, I hope none of our viewers yet, their eyes glaze over once you talk about this. But the fact is that the easiest way of explaining it, I think, is there's absolutely no point in a free trading country, very dependent on trade, putting new barriers just to satisfy a political movement, new barriers between trade and investment, and driving away foreign investors as a result. We hit our economy very badly.
But we are running out of time, though, Mr. Clark.
It's a long transition deal.
Yeah, but it's a long transition period, but we're running out of time to agree. We're running out of time to agree that those things. Jeremy Brown, the city's special... After you,
We're
Mr.
not going to
Clark.
agree any of this in 1990. We're not going to agree any of this by 1990. That's why we need a long transitional period, interim period, whatever you require. That's inevitable. Otherwise, the idea that you jump off the cliff and then put out your arms and you soar off into those wide blue skies yonder, with everybody in the world rushing forward to open up their markets to you in trade deals, that's all rubbish. We obviously need, and everybody's accepting, and ministers are quietly hinting, that we need a transition period. That means 2, 3, 4 years in which we stay essentially with the status quo as long as business and industry is concerned. And
Mr. Clark, sorry, I have to interrupt at this point. There are others within your party, including Ian Duncan-Smith and a number of others, who make the point that if you want to have a transitional agreement, you need to know to what you are transitioning. Ultimately, it looks like Phase 1 discussions will not be, they will not have agreed that we've made sufficient progress in October. That means it will be December before we do it, which means negotiations on trade and on transition start in January. That gives us 10 months to sort out all the detail. Can it be done?
No. Not remotely, not sensible to believe it can be done. What we're on transition to is, as the government makes quite clear, we hope a free trade agreement with the European Union in which we're not a member, we're a third-party country, and outside we've got satisfactory arrangements to carry on trading with them, which has been done by other countries, done by Canada, been done by Norway, been done by Switzerland, and Prime Minister Theresa keeps saying she wants a different one, a special one for Britain. Well, that's going to take a lot of discussion. It is hugely complicated. And what you can't do is say, well, unless we know exactly where we're going to, we're suddenly going to put tariff barriers, regulatory barriers, have new customs procedures at our borders, and we're not going to have people coming to work here in the health service anymore. That would be utterly lunatic because of this deadline in 1990. Sorry, do I talk about it's deadline in 2019, which it's simply not enough time.
Mr. Clark, before we get to that,
what we invoke.
Mr. Clark, I just want to move us on slightly. I mean, before we get into all of that, before we even reach that point, we have the small matter of the second reading of the EU withdrawal bill. Now, you and a number of others have raised concerns about the Henry VIII clauses, this power grab, nominal power grab, supposed power grab by the government. How are you minded to vote tomorrow?
Well, it depends. If the government, I think, is going to have to change the wording of the bill. I mean, the basic point to make all the European regulations, British regulations, needs a bill, so that they should have brought forward one that's properly drafted. But a government that started by saying it didn't want Parliament to have anything to do with this, it was going to use the royal prerogative, and we weren't even going to have a vote on Article 50, has somehow induced the draftsman to produce a bill which would give Henry VIII powers which he would have been delighted by. And just in case they need them, they've given themselves sweeping powers to put in place whatever arrangements they want on any subject, to actually decide how much money we give to the Europeans without Parliament having a vote on it. This is ridiculous. If they come back tomorrow and say, of course they're going to amend it, we've been reassured they're not going to use these powers in any policy-making way at all, well, I think Parliament would be sensible to get them to write it so they're not giving themselves the possibility of using powers that no government's ever tried to take at the expense of Parliament before. Then we can get on to the substance, which is all this about are any rules going to be changed in such a way that we get in the way of our trade with Europe, or changes our arrangements with Europe in any other way, which the government seems to be saying, on the whole, no, it's not.
In discussion of politics these days, Mr. Clark, sorry to interrupt. In discussion of politics these days, we're never far away from comments about the Conservative leadership. Jacob Rees-Mogg perhaps damaged his chances this week with some choice words on abortion. Given the party's direction on the European Union, given the words of Mr. Rees-Mogg, I just wonder, would a young Ken Clarke naturally gravitate towards the Conservative Party?
Well, I joined the modernisers in the Conservative Party at a time when we were campaigning for Britain to join the European Union. There's an irony about my career. In my first Parliament, Britain joined the European Community. It's benefited, I think, for the 40-odd years that I've been in politics. My last Parliament, we're deciding to leave it for a lot of silly populist reasons. But as you say, everybody turns to the leadership. When the Conservative Party can't think of anything else to do, it tends to have a leadership crisis when it's rather puzzled by policies. And the reason is, I mean, I'm quite aware of the fact that the things we've been talking about in this interview, they're complicated, they're quite difficult. They concern investors and trade union leaders and businessmen more than the ordinary member of the public. The Eurosceptic campaigners offered simplicity. This dangerous, changing world, all these foreigners living here now, all Brussels' fault, leave the EU, one bound we're free, and a brave new world will emerge. Well, that is nonsense, and it's no good diverting ourselves by saying, would Jacob Rees-Mogg be a 21st century Prime Minister, which I suspect Jacob thinks is rather a silly question, certainly at this stage of his career. I'm afraid the government has to be given only the powers required to manage a transition. We've got many years of complicated negotiations in front of us. Our economy is in a very worrying state. I mean, we have slowed down very badly. The outlook is very uncertain. We need as soon as possible an assurance that economically and in trade terms, our arrangements with Europe are going to carry on for some years as they are now, so that this can all be sorted out sensibly. It's our children and our grandchildren we should be thinking about, not next week's newspaper headlines. Can we have fun with a kind of Strictly Come Dancing type contest between people who want to be Prime Minister? Theresa May is there. There's no prospect of her being replaced by anybody sensible in any sensible process. For the next 2 or 3 years, Theresa's got the job of presiding over a smooth transition through a long transition period to an arrangement that at least will minimise the damage in a few years' time.
Ken Clark, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. And I did even have a question about you, whether or not you'd consider an appearance on Strictly Come Dancing at some stage after your parliamentary clear. But we'll leave that. No, we'll leave that for the next time.
Certainly not the Bake Off. Standing in leadership elections is the only bad habit I've ever given up.
Ken Clark, thanks very much for being with us.
Pleasure.
The Labour Party stunned political observers over the summer by coming up with a Brexit policy regarding transition that was, at the very least, semi-coherent, even if it completely contradicts their policies of the last 12 months. To talk about that now, we're joined from Leicester by the Shadow Health Secretary, John Ashworth. Mr Ashworth, many thanks for being with us. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Just to be on the safe side, just to be absolutely clear, can you just tell us what the Labour Party's position on Brexit is this week?
I think it's a very mischievous way of putting the question on your first day in the new job now. But let me be clear. Look, we accept Brexit. You know, obviously we campaign to remain in the European Union, but we accept what the British people voted for, which is why before the general election we voted to trigger the Article 50 to begin the negotiations. But we've always said we want a Brexit deal which puts jobs, puts prosperity, puts people's livelihoods first, which is why we've been calling for these transitional arrangements, which is why we're pressing the government to put in place measures that support jobs and prosperity. So we haven't shifted our position. We always accept that the British people have voted for Brexit, but that doesn't mean we have to give carte blanche to the government. It means that we need to speak out for people's livelihoods and people's businesses and for people's jobs here in constituencies like my own of Leicester South.
Come on, Mr Ashworth. Let's talk about this transitional agreement that many saw as a victory for Sir Keir Starmer over the leadership, in which he insisted there should be a transitional period during which you remain in the customs union and in the single market. However, John McDonnell, June the 11th, I think people will interpret membership of the single market as not respecting that referendum. Emily Thornberry, we're leaving the European Union, that means we need to leave the single market. Jeremy Corbyn asked to be categorically clear if we're leaving the single market. He said yes. Are we sure this policy is going to last?
Well, of course the policy is going to last, and there isn't any big differences here. We've always said from the day of the referendum result that our red lines were about jobs, that our red lines were about living standards in this country.
You also said that we weren't going to be in the single market.
Cliff edge as the, yeah, but also trundling towards a cliff edge as the government are taking towards is not in the interests of businesses. It's not in the interests of jobs and prosperity of the British people. That is why we have called for transitional arrangements. Part of the reason, by the way, why we need these transitional arrangements is because the government have wasted months and months and months in the negotiation period. The government started negotiations, then called a general election for partisan interest and not the national interest. Part of the reason the government's negotiations are so behind now is because of their party politicking back in May and June, which came back to bite them on the backside quite severely. So look, we've always said we want to do what is in the interests of British jobs and the economy, and we believe a transitional arrangement is putting the interests of the economy first.
I mean, you mentioned party politicking there. I mean, there's a point of principle at stake in all of this. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, he's been fighting against the European Union for years. Ever since the referendum, he's been saying he respects the result, will be outside the single market, free movement will come to an end. I mean, now he's got the merest sniff of power after the general election. He's pulled a screeching U-turn. I thought he was a man of principle.
Well, I think it is an entirely principled position to put the needs of the economy first.
It's a different principled position to the one that he previously adopted.
No. You can accept that the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union. You can accept the result of the referendum. You can accept that negotiations have to begin with the European Union, which is why we triggered Article 50. But you can equally argue that you need to put in place measures, in this case the transitional arrangements, to ensure that our economy is not adversely affected. I don't think the two positions are contrary. I think the two positions are complementary, and I think it is the principled thing to put the economy first in this situation.
We were given a clue as to where all of this might be heading by the Deputy Leader, Tom Watson. He said that staying inside the single market could be a permanent outcome. Is that the case?
No, I don't think that is the case. I mean, obviously we are leaving the European Union, but what we've always argued for is a deal with the European Union that allows what we call frictionless trade, which allows companies here in Leicester to carry on exporting to the European Union, allows the movement of goods across borders. Because if we bring up barriers, that is going to affect our prosperity as a nation. But it's also going to affect our public services. Over 100,000 people from the European Union work within the National Health Service or in the social care sector. I'm very concerned that unless we get a deal to allow people who work in the NHS and the social care sector to remain in the United Kingdom and allow the NHS to continue to recruit, then the NHS will be severely affected. I suspect in a few moments you'll ask me about staffing issues in the NHS. We're 40,000 nurses short in the NHS. It's having an impact on care at the front line, which is, of course, why we are calling for the public sector pay cap to be lifted this Wednesday. And I hope Conservative MPs vote with us when we bring that motion to the House of Commons on Wednesday. OK, Mr Ashworth, you're speaking to us from Leicester, where admittedly the EU referendum vote was marginal, but across Leicestershire, people there voted, massively in favour of exiting the European Union. Now you're telling them that we will leave the European Union in 2019, but at that point there won't be any more control over immigration, there won't be any chance to negotiate any new trade deals for years. I mean, are you telling me that that's what you think, that Labour-supporting Leave voters believed that they were going to get from the Labour Party? Well, in the city of Leicester, my Leicester South constituency voted to remain. We certainly saw that on the referendum evening. But look, we are not blocking Brexit. Brexit is going to go ahead. The British people voted for Brexit, but what we are trying to do is get a deal which safeguards jobs and the economy. And by the way, I also remember very prominent members of this Conservative cabinet telling us we're going to have 350 million a week for the National Health Service. Now, just last week, the head of hospital trusts said that this winter is going to be very severe and that they need an extra 350 million injected into the NHS to avoid a very severe winter like the one we've just had. And yet we're not getting an extra penny piece for the NHS. Well,
let's conclude, shall we, by talking about public sector pay. The Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, is down in Brighton today, lending his support to calls for strike action. Are we nearing the point where more coordinated strike action is required? I mean, would the Labour Party stand in support of a general strike?
I hope not, because I believe that when we have a strike, it's a sign of failure. What the government need to do is understand the concerns of the people who work in our National Health Service and the wider public services and get rid of this pay cap. We keep getting briefings in newspapers and suggestions that the government is sympathetic and wants to do something and, oh, you know, it's terrible, they accept that, but, you know, let's see where we get to. Well, we're bringing a vote to the House of Commons on Wednesday, and those Conservative members of Parliament who have sincerely said they believe the pay cap should go, we're calling on them to vote with us, and I'm calling on your viewers to lobby those Conservative members of Parliament and let me know what they say.
But
we can
briefly,
put an end to the pay cap on Wednesday for the NHS staff if they vote with us.
On that point of principle, very briefly, Mr Ashworth, would the Labour Party stand in support of a general strike if that was what the unions wished, called for and achieved?
Well, people go on strike for industrial reasons. They don't go on strike for political reasons. And obviously, if people take industrial action, then the Labour Party supports people who take industrial action. But we don't want it to get to that stage. We don't want to see a strike. We don't want to see nurses going on strike and wider public servants going on strike. And the way to avoid that is for the government to understand the concerns of public sector workers and get rid of this unfair pay cap. We've got huge staffing problems in the NHS. We've got nurses leaving the NHS, and we're 40,000 short of nurses. We are short of 3,500 midwives. We're short of GPs. The government have to give the NHS a fair pay rise. They can't carry on asking NHS staff to do more and more on less and less.
John Ashworth, many thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Now, you've heard from the other side of the Brexit debate. Now let's hear from a true believer. Joining me in the studio now, the Justice Minister, and I think it's fair to say passionate believer, Dominic Raab. Thank you very much for being with us. Let's dive straight on in with what appears to be a real sticking point in the negotiations at the moment, the financial settlement. What, in your mind, would be an appropriate sum to hand over?
Well, we're not going around banding figures around. What David Davis has said is, look, you're saying that we're legally obliged to pay money, but we want a line-by-line accounting of what you expect. And I think that's what the British public expect. They wouldn't expect us to be handing over massive dollops of money or regular contributions to the EU club when we're leaving. But this is a matter of negotiation, and as the EU always says, there's no deal until you've got the whole deal.
Yeah, I mean, if they said, well, give us 10 billion euros, you'd bite their hand off, wouldn't you?
Well, I think David Davis has quite rightly said he's not going to negotiate on air, and I'm not going to do so by proxy for him. But look, we will pay what we are due legally, but I think if that's the criteria, and that sounds pretty sensible to me, we'd expect the EU to come back and line by line go through what they expect and they think that we owe.
The problem is that from the EU's perspective, at the very least, until that financial agreement that financial settlement is agreed, they seem unlikely to want to move forward to the next stage, which we desperately want to get to, those trade talks. I mean, how confident are you that when they meet in October, they will say sufficient progress has been made?
Well, let's see how the negotiations go. But
how confident?
Well, let me explain. The EU has published a series of position papers responding to the ones that we've done. There is progress on areas like Northern Ireland, like protection of rights of EU nationals here, UK expats abroad. But also the EU has popped up and said, well, what about intellectual property protection for French cheese and Parma ham? That is a trade issue. And I think the dynamic of this negotiation, not just because we want it, as you rightly said, but for the EU is going to inevitably need to lead on to that. And the EU shifted its ground at the start of the negotiations. They didn't say we'd do it in strict sequence. They said, well, we'll move to twin track when we've made sufficient progress. So we're starting to see some flexibility amidst the media din.
I mean, you're not just negotiating with Brussels, though, are you? You're also negotiating with members of your own party. I mean, the European Research Group, of which you were a member, are you still?
No, I'm a member of the government now, so I don't engage in backbench groups in the way that I would have done when I had the freedom of the backbenches.
Well, they make it pretty clear that they will not countenance, and it's a group of, estimates vary. You might be able to tell me who's in it and how many there are, but estimates vary between 60 and 80 people who believe that a transitional agreement which involves continued membership of the single market would be a mistake. Do you agree with that?
Well, look, we've said that you've got to know where what the final deal looks like before you know the bridge, which is the interim deal. And look, people, whether it's the ERG or others on the more Remain side, can have their arguments. It's not all about us, though. You talked about the divisions. Well, there are divisions on the EU side, and no one really talks about the French president of the northern region of France, who's looked at our customs proposals and said, actually, these seem very sensible. Or the Spanish Prime Minister, who said, a trade deal is going to be really important for us.
Yeah, but it's difficult to see where progress progress has been made. We haven't made progress as it stands in terms of the financial settlement. We don't appear to have a plan in place as regards a transitional agreement, even if the Cabinet now finally agrees with it. I mean, the draft immigration plan that was leaked this week, I mean, that went down like a bucket of cold sick in boardrooms up and down the country. National Farmers Union, Hospitality Association, TUC. I mean, the problems that you have on your plate at the moment are getting bigger and bigger by the day.
The first point you made is there's been no progress. David Davis went to the House of Commons this week. He gave a statement. He pointed to some of the areas where we've made progress on EU nationals and their rights here, UK expats abroad. That's very important for the certainty and the smooth transition. We've also had, I think, a gradual coming together on the Northern Ireland issue. And of course, on Monday, we vote on the EU withdrawal bill. One of the great opportunities of Brexit that many people voted for was to take back democratic control over our laws. That's what we're doing come Monday night.
We'll talk about that in just a moment. But in terms of the immigration plan that was leaked this week, I mean, if you're going to get to that target of tens of thousands, you're going to annoy a huge number of people in a variety of industries across the country. That, at least, is fair.
And what we're going to do is give effect to the referendum, and also, I think, the widespread public opinion that thinks they're not racist, didn't have 17 million racist people voting for Brexit, but want some command and some control over the immigration system. And we can do that in a sensible way, which gets the best advantages for the economy and for businesses, but also exerts control over the overall numbers, make sure people that come here are self-sufficient, and let's face it as well, make sure, particularly at a time of heightened security concern, that we've got proper checks around the border. I think that's a sensible plan, and of course, the detail of it's being worked up, and I'm not going to comment on leaked reports in newspapers.
OK, so we don't know what the divorce bill is going to be. We don't know what's going to happen with immigration. I mean, it's little wonder that the EU negotiating team are starting to lose their rag with you.
Well, there's been all sorts of personal jibes and suggestions that the British people for voting for Brexit were stupid and need to be taught a lesson. I'm not going to engage in any of that. I think it's unprofessional. We want to be good friends with our European partners at the end of this, and that's what we're aiming for.
So when are we going to start talking about trade? I mean, Jeremy Brown, a man I'm sure you know well, City Special Representative, says that there's a 1% chance that we'll get past phase 1 this October, which means we will be starting the trade negotiation process the beginning of next year. You've just conceded that there will have to be a transition. You can only work out the transitional agreement once you know where you're ultimately going to get to. So you've got 10 months. 10 months to work out a bespoke trade deal and the transitional agreement. You can't do it.
Well, look, if you were starting from scratch, you might be right, but we're not starting from scratch. We're starting from barrier-free trade. And I think there's going to be a huge mutual self-interest in saying, hold on a minute here, as all sorts of people from the German BDI, which is the equivalent of the German Confederation of Business and Industry, right the way through to the Spanish Prime Minister who's talked about the need for a win-win deal on this. And that means really saying, well, do we need any more barriers to trade? That's in no one's interest. So I don't accept the time frame you set out. But look, we're making progress on the negotiation. And of course, it's the maximum point of pressure for us because the EU wants to hang tough on money. We're going to go through this in a sensible British way, line by line, but we'll get there.
Let's look at the kind of the domestic end of the Brexit debate now and the EU withdrawal bill. A bit of a fight pending in terms of the Commons. I mean, speaking to Ken Clarke earlier, he says that he is minded to vote with the government as long as concessions are willing to be made. Are concessions there ready?
Well, let's just, first of all, what's this EU bill doing? It's the withdrawal bill takes control of our laws so that people like me are accountable to people at home for the laws of the land, and the UK Supreme Court has the last word. This is the huge opportunity from Brexit. At the same time, we've got to make sure we do it in a smooth way. We want a smooth transition, a smooth Brexit. All the other stuff is about the procedural means to achieving that. So I'm delighted Ken's going to be voting at second reading. And the question of scrutiny and the processes, we'll have a sensible conversation, we'll get it right. But what you've heard from Ken Clarke is every Conservative, from the staunch Remainer to the Brexit, is fully behind the two strategic objectives of this bill. And that's good news.
Yeah, but his concern is that it's the power grab that appears to be going on at the moment. And it's not just Ken Clarke, it's the man that you used to be, Chief of Staff for, the former Attorney General, Dominic Grieve. And in fact, it's also the House of Commons Library. I mean, just take a look at this. It says that these powers are unprecedented in both their legal scope and constitutional significance. Do you disagree with the House of Commons Library?
No, these are unprecedented negotiations in an unprecedented time.
So what are the unprecedented safeguards then?
Well, look, so 7 pieces of legislation will come through with the normal scrutiny. That'll deal with the most important stuff. There will also be the need for technical matters to be corrected so that we have that smooth Brexit. Now, whether it's Ken, whether it's Dominic, whether it's Anna Soubry, and I listened to all their comments in the House of Commons Commons this week. We can have a conversation about how we maximise the scrutiny, but it's got to be with a view to delivering the smooth Brexit in time, because we've got a two-year deadline.
What does that mean? Further ways of looking at the way in which these statutory instruments are used. What do you mean by that?
Well, most of the stuff is going to be done either via primary legislation or secondary legislation with the maximum scrutiny. It's only the detailed technical stuff, or where we need to make changes at the 11th hour because of the way the negotiations
we're looking at perhaps as many as 1,000 statutory instruments.
Well, exactly. So this deadline on us, Niall, is not the UK's choosing. It's not the government that's chosen it, it's the EU that's given us the 2-year deadline. But for example, Anna Soubry talked in the House of Commons about some sort of triage system, effectively saying what's the most important stuff that needs the maximum scrutiny and what's really just the chipping and chiselling, which would go through the other procedure. Even then, any MP can put their hands up in the House of Commons and call a vote on it. So this idea that there's no scrutiny and there'll be no accountability is quite wrong. I note, if you may, that those that are worried about this process weren't quite so concerned about all the EU legislation that was passed almost through exactly the same route.
Well, Ken Clarke was getting warned about statutory instruments back in 2010. I wonder what you think of Tony Blair's intervention today. He thinks that we can stay within the European Union, that we can give people what they ultimately want, control over immigration. We can do it domestically, and the EU will obviously fall into step with us. What do you think?
Well, I read his article because I want to take the other side of the argument seriously, but I'd say just sort of 3 points of fact, if you like. First of all, you know, Tony Blair was the guy that introduced the open door immigration that we're now trying to resolve because the public feel very concerned about it. We've also tried to get the kind of deal he talked about with the EU, and the EU has said no. And then there is the small matter of the referendum, where the British people decided to leave the EU, and we're going to deliver that. And come Monday evening, I think the Labour Party will have their cards called, because they toured up and down the country saying that they were going to back Brexit, and now they're voting against this whole bill. That is a fraud. It's Jeremy Corbyn's biggest con trick on Labour voters and the public at large yet.
What did you make of Jacob Rees-Monk's comments on abortion this week? I mean, bring you up a poll from Conservative Home in terms of, you know, the runners and riders for the leadership. We suspect that he will not be at 23% anymore, but look who's in third place. It's you. That's rather gratifying, isn't it?
Now, one of the interesting things about being in politics, you compare it to other walks of life. If I was working for a business and I was walking around the canteen with other workers, talking about who's going to be the next boss, talking about that with clients, most people...
Talk about the chap who's not going to be the next boss. What do you make of his comments on abortion?
Most people think it would be rude and grossly unprofessional, which is why I'm not going to give that tittle-tattle any sucker at all.
OK, what do you think of his comments on abortion?
Well, I don't agree with that, but I also respect the fact, you know, I support the laws broadly as they currently are. But that's an issue of conscience, and he's a Catholic, so I'm not going to jump down on people, down the throat of people that take a different view.
I mean, you said this yourself back in the day. Feminists are now among the most obnoxious bigots. Does the Conservative Party have a problem with women? Rees-Mogg comments on abortion, your comments on feminism. I mean, you're not men's rights activists, are you?
No. Look, that was 6 years ago, by the way. You picked out one line.
We have had it there.
I understand. One line of a much bigger... I made one simple point. I'm against sexism against a woman or against a man, and actually equality should cut both ways. So come on, this is nonsense. We've got record levels of female MPs coming through, making ministerial rank. The gender pay gap is at record low. And in particular, one of the bigger points I was making about the equality debate back then is that most young couples, myself included, two salary couples, share the breadwinning and the childcaring between them. They're not really engaged in a battle of sexes. They're a team. And so the stuff that we've done on childcare, tax breaks over childcare, allow couples to make the choices themselves and also give working women the opportunity to get that balance right for themselves.
I'm afraid we will have to leave it there. An appropriate moment on which to finish. Dominic Raab, many thanks for being with us.
Now, more now on former Prime Minister Tony Blair's call for the UK to toughen its immigration laws so that it can be no need to leave the EU. He's admitted the open borders he presided over in office are no longer appropriate, but still says Brexit would be disastrous for the country.
If we want to deal with those questions, we can deal with them without the sledgehammer that, as it were, through Brexit, destroys the EU migration that we'll actually need, because my paper shows that we actually need most of these EU migrants, and it doesn't, of course, deal with the other parts of the immigration issue, which I think are the greater concern. In the end, Brexit is a distraction, not a solution to the problems this country faces. If members of Parliament really believe that, then their obligation is to set out solutions that deal with the actual problems communities and people have, and not do Brexit, which is actually going to distract us from those solutions and going to cause real economic and political damage.
Well, there's Tony Blair's reaction there. Let's get more on this. Join me now to discuss it in a bit more detail is the former Border Control Officer Chris Hobbs, and in our central London studio is George Eaton, political editor for The New Statesman. Let's start with you, Chris, if you don't mind. Those comments, pretty strong from Tony Blair, though, but some criticising him because, of course, he had no restrictions on immigration back in 2004.
Well, that is an issue, isn't it? He says now the situation has changed, the vista has changed, and now is the time perhaps that controls need to be reintroduced. I think his comments this morning, I know for a fact, have had Border Force officers shaking their heads sadly or clutching their sides with mirth, because in terms of the sheer practicality of what he was suggesting, now in registering people at airports and seaports as they come in, for example, to see whether they've got jobs, that is not going to be practicable. It's going to lead to total chaos at our airports and seaports. But on the other hand, Theresa May's proposals, 2- and 5-year visas, as it were, or something similar, are going to lead to similar chaos. So there is a saying at the moment amongst football fans when they chant to the referee, "You don't know what you're doing." And you get the feeling that politicians, be they Tony Blair, Theresa May or whoever, in terms of borders, border controls, EU nationals, really don't know what they're doing.
Fair enough. Let's bring George in now, if you don't mind. What is your reaction to Tony Blair's comments? I presume that you're probably in favour of them.
Well, I think free movement has been of huge benefit to the UK, and EU migrants contribute far more in tax revenue than, for instance, they claim in welfare benefits. I think that has to be the fundamental point. And as an ageing population, we will, if anything, rely more on EU migrants in the future rather than less, as the birth rate here falls on, and as we have more pensioners to support. But the point Tony Blair makes is an important one, that there is scope within the existing EU rules to impose greater control on free movement, for instance, to force EU migrants to leave the country if they don't have a job offer within 3 months. Of course, there are practical and technical issues that need to be looked at, but there are other EU countries which already apply these rules fairly smoothly. And having some degree of control over free movement is far more preferable to the Home Office proposals this week, which would cause significant damage to the UK economy, particularly in sectors that are highly reliant on immigration, such as social care, agriculture and hospitality.
But George, staying with you, Tony Blair has suggested that we remain in the European Union, but this is a democratic decision and people want to leave.
Yes, and I think Tony Blair would acknowledge that the opinion polls have shown little shift in the public mood since the referendum. But of course, in these febrile times, opinion can shift quickly. And I think one of the fundamental principles of democracy is that something like a referendum is not cast in stone, that the people do have the ability to change their minds if they so wish. And given, for instance, that we now know there's not going to be £350 million for the NHS a week, Brexit is already doing harm to the British economy. For instance, we're seeing living standards squeezed. We haven't seen the increase in exports that the Brexiteers promised. All of that means that there is some logic to, after the Brexit process is finished in 2019, to the public be given a chance, once the deal is known, to approve or to reject it.
OK, Chris, what do you make of that?
Well, basically, I agree. Certainly, I'm concerned with what the end result will be. I'm also from a part of London just up the road from here where there are a lot of East Europeans, Poles, Lithuanians. They work incredibly hard. Who's going to serve me my beer and my coffee? Great people, hard workers who want to make a life here, and all of a sudden they're being told it's in the balance. Some don't mind, they'll say, we'll just go to Germany or back home. Others with families really looked or want to stay here for a goodly while. So there's lots of issues, and I don't think as yet this government is really exploring the issues or, as we just heard, the possible consequences of a hard Brexit. And certainly borders are going to be thrown into complete and utter chaos.
So what do politicians do, though, Chris? Because David Cameron tried to tackle the issue to get immigration down to the tens of thousands. No one has managed it. So what's the solution?
Well, if you want to impose some sort of controls, be they soft controls or hard controls, just in terms of borders, you need more border force officers, you need to stop the cuts, you need to have a coherent policy, and at the moment there isn't. We're just hearing ideas that frankly are being scoffed at by people who are on the front line, who will have to implement these proposals. If you've got EU nationals that are here illegally, for example, they haven't got a job. Who's going to chase them? Who's going to chase them and remove them from the country? Enforcement officers? There's not enough of them now to cope with the work they've got. So all these issues, you do seem to have issues here that have not been fully thought through, and that includes the service industry, the National Health Service, all these areas where we do depend on migrant workers. I am concerned, and I'm not really looking forward to the post-Brexit period, but I'm still not going to tell you how I voted.
Are you not? George, how about you then? Tony Blair's comments today, is he just meddling? Surely he should step aside and let people get on with it. That's what people are saying, at least.
There are some on the pro-EU wing of the Labour Party and in other parties who very much feel that way. Tony Blair, the polls show this, is not a popular figure in British politics. You've got the right, the Conservatives, who never liked him because of some of his policies and because he was quite good at beating the Tory party in elections. And then, of course, you've got the left, who are still enraged with him over issues such as the Iraq War, tuition fees, and what they see as his ill conduct out of office, the dash for cash. Some of the leaders he did business with, such as the leader of Kazakhstan. And but look, Tony Blair is a former Prime Minister. He was in office for 13 years. He has considerable experience in EU affairs, and he is speaking as someone, as a citizen actually, who believes that the country is about to commit what could be an epic act of national self-harm. So it's not surprising that he feels the need to speak out, and he has years of experience to draw on. But on a political level, and Tony Blair was always someone who was aware of political sensitivities, he isn't the best person to make the case for rejecting Brexit. And I think he will be making his appearances rather fleetingly as a result of that.
OK, George Easton and Chris Hobbs, thanks ever so much for your expertise and your time. Appreciate that.
Well, here, the former Prime Minister Tony Blair has called for tough new curbs on immigration, allowing Britain to control the number of people entering the country without leaving the EU. Mr Blair, who's been blamed for allowing uncontrolled migration from new EU member states when he was in power, said back then conditions had been different, and the crucial thing was avoiding Brexit. But critics said his change of heart had simply come too late. Simeon Brown reports.
Remainers don't come much more diehard than Tony Blair. The former Prime Minister now wants Britain to introduce a range of tougher immigration rules in the hope it can avert Brexit.
Brexit is a distraction, not a solution to the problems this country faces. If members of Parliament really believe that, then their obligation is to set out solutions that deal with the actual problems communities and people have, and not do Brexit, which is actually going to distract us from those solutions and going to cause real economic and political damage.
Some of the measures Mr Blair wants include forcing EU migrants to register on arrival, charging EU students higher tuition fees, and insisting EU migrants have proof of work before they enter the UK. It's unclear whether any of these plans were discussed with the man in charge of the EU Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, when the two men met less than a fortnight ago. But what is clear is that this represents a U-turn for Mr Blair. His government chose not to restrict and monitor access to UK labour markets from new members like Poland in 2004, when other EU members did. So, is anyone listening?
Tony still thinks we can stay in the EU. I think the mood in the country, it's hopeless to expect that.
The country's decided we're leaving the European Union, and we've got, we've got to get on with that. Tony Blair's got to get over it, and we've got to get to a smooth and successful exit from the Union. But that will involve some proper controls over immigration. I think that's what the country wants to see.
But this is unlikely to be the last intervention from the former Prime Minister. He and ardent Remainers face a dilemma. If they cannot derail a process that's already underway, how much of their core value do they abandon to try and divert to hard Brexit? If Mr Blair was hoping his proposals might appease the anti-immigration sentiment behind part of the Brexit vote, he may be over 10 years too late.